Hi, this is documentary filmmaker John Ziegler. I run the website framingpaterno.com, and this is going to be a rather unusual video commentary for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's going to be of particularly bad production quality, as you can probably already tell, because I'm doing this video very quickly because I have just received access to video portions, or actually the entire video, of the documentary film Happy Valley, which is about the entire Jerry Sandusky Penn State scandal or story, depending on your perspective. And I don't know when I'm going to lose that access. So it's late at night, and I'm going to do this video commentary right away to make sure I don't lose access to this video. And so I'll be able to give you exclusive clips from this movie, fair using that with commentary, before this film actually airs, I believe on A&E sometime in November. So that's the purpose of this. That's why the video is going to be a little bit different than normal. And I hope you'll bear with us because the content here is really compelling and very, very important. Now, I'm going to do two videos here about this movie, Happy Valley. Number one, this one here, is going to be focusing on Joe Pausnansky and Scott Paterno. Joe Pausnansky, the author of the book Paterno, and Scott Paterno, and their role in this film when it comes to really the key episode of the entire story, which is the Mike McQueary episode. Now, before we get into what Pausnansky and Scott Paterno said in this movie, I want to give you a little bit of background as far as what this movie is and my tangential role, I guess, not in the movie, but I guess alongside the movie, for lack of a better term. This movie has been in the works since almost immediately after the story broke. And the executive producer is a guy by the name of Jonathan Cotch. Now, Jonathan Cotch is an interesting figure, and it's kind of amazing to me that he is not more well known with regard to the news media coverage of this story, because this film got a lot of publicity when it debuted at Sundance, and Matt Sandusky was the big star of the film with his Cheshire Cat grin there on the red carpet, basically coming out as the star, having done his first major interview since suddenly becoming a victim of Jerry Sandusky in the middle of the Sandusky trial. Well, Jonathan Cotch, first of all, is a huge Penn State fan from as a kid, big Joe Paterno fan, which I actually think worked against him because I think it required him to do a film that could not possibly be the exoneration of Joe Paterno, because he would have no political cover for that perspective. Now, it's important to note he's the boss here. I don't think he made the production decisions, but everybody knows what the boss wants. The other thing here that's important to note is not only was he a Penn State guy, and this is incredible to me that he's doing this film or having anything to do with it and not becoming a huge media story, he was part of the Second Mile. Now, I'm not 100% sure what his role was, whether he was both a kid and a counselor or one or the other. I'm not 100% sure, but he told me he was part of the Second Mile, and he told me that he actually played basketball with Jerry Sandusky, and that Jerry Sandusky had knocked him in the face pretty hard and apparently injured him with an elbow. Interestingly, I asked Jerry about this in prison last year. Actually, it was earlier this year. It was a long time ago. But it was earlier this year, and Jerry laughed. He said he didn't remember that, but it sounded like him, which in the context of prison and the nature of this case was kind of a funny moment. So there's that, and there's no question in my meetings with Jonathan that he has great animus towards Jerry Sandusky, and it's not just because he had that interaction with Jerry. It was very clear to me that Jonathan Cotch's perspective on this case was that everybody knew that Jerry was a pedophile, and that's pretty much almost a quote, what he told me, which I didn't agree with at the time. Now, the reason I was meeting with him was because I was being considered to direct this movie, Happy Valley. And it was very clear to both of us, I think, certainly before our second meeting, that was never going to happen, because I was way too pro-Joe Paterno and way too anti-news media for the narrative that Jonathan was looking for. But I was told by a former close friend, a friend I've lost because of this whole incredibly insane story and this element of it, that job was mine if I basically hadn't talked myself out of it. It's probably better that I didn't take the job because I clearly would have been fired at some point anyway, but here and there, that's the reality. I also happen to believe, and this is not something I can prove, but I'm pretty certain of it, after 2 very, very long, extensive, and incredibly emotional meetings with Jonathan Cotch, I'm almost positive that he was a victim of child sexual abuse. Again, obviously, that's not his fault, it's not a negative, but it's an incredibly important fact that the executive producer of this film not only is a Penn Stater and a second mile person, but a victim of child sex abuse. That's some pretty heavy conflicts of interest when it comes to doing a film on, obviously, the biggest, most famous alleged case of child sexual abuse in American history. So all that is pretty incredibly important. By the way, the reason why I'm almost positive of it is of the way that Jonathan reacted to this particular subject in an incredibly emotional way during our meetings. And also, I wrote about this, and I know Jonathan got very upset about it, but he in no way, shape, or form denied it. And in fact, other people have said completely outside of my experience that they believe the same thing, knowing Jonathan. Again, I'm not making a criticism at all of Jonathan for that, but that's an important fact to understand, assuming that it is a fact, when it comes to the context of the guy who's the executive producer of this film. All right, so now that's the backdrop. Also, for background, after it was clear I was not going to be part of the film, they asked me, or I was told I would be interviewed for the film. That never happened, allegedly because of scheduling, but I knew right away it was not scheduling. But Jonathan had said he wanted me interviewed. It never occurred. Then I interviewed Jerry Sandusky. They said they wanted the interview. They asked for it in a very strange and I thought unprofessional fashion. I gave them the transcript and said, hey, if you want the actual interview, maybe we can talk and work something out. They saw the transcript. It obviously didn't fit their narrative, especially when it came to the McQueary episode, so they never contacted me after that. And the only thing I know is that they're very ticked off by what I've written about their efforts, their film, and especially with regard to their using of Matt Sandusky as their star. I have warned them flat out. They're risking their entire reputations and careers, hitching their wagon to Matt Sandusky, who's the biggest liar in the entire case. But for some reason, they haven't believed me, and they're going full bore, apparently, with this. And as I said, I'm doing a second video on that particular element of Matt Sandusky and his lawyer basically being the co-stars of this film. The co-stars, by the way, which are never even identified as two people who have made millions of dollars from this case. The worst part about this film, of many elements that are terrible, is that it has an incredible number of massive omissions. The sin or the crime of omission, I think, is often more heinous than commission when it comes to documentaries. And there are dozens and dozens of sins of omission in Happy Valley. And there's some sins of commission. As a matter of fact, I want to play for you a clip here of a sin of commission, maybe the biggest sin of commission in the entire film, because it's done by a guy by the name of Joe Pausnansky, who, as I mentioned earlier, wrote the autobiography of Joe Paterno, and really was the guy who was there. I mean, he was in the catbird seat during this entire situation. He was shadowing Joe Paterno during this entire time period, and for some bizarre reason found absolutely not one shred of evidence that Joe Paterno knew anything about Jerry Sandusky being a pedophile or that there was any sort of a cover-up, which of course is absurd. I mean, he was there for that critical year of 2011 and saw and found nothing, and he had every incentive in the world to reveal it if he had. He had the biggest scoop on the planet and saw and heard nothing. That didn't stop him from throwing Joe Paterno under the bus. See, I believe that Joe Pausnansky is one of the biggest cowards of many cowards in this entire case, because I think Joe Pausnansky knew that Joe Paterno had been railroaded and was in a perfect position to lead the charge against that railroading, but he sat silent largely, and then when his book came out, he tried to play it both ways so that he could keep his membership in the media club. See, the elite media is a club. Once you get your membership pass, you desperately don't want to lose it. And I think Joe Pausnansky was afraid he would lose his membership in that media club if he didn't throw Joe Paterno under the bus to some degree. And then, of course, in the book itself, he tries to compliment Joe Paterno so that he'll sell books. I really have no patience for that kind of stuff, and it's unfortunately emblematic of everything that's happened to the news media in this day and age. But Pausnansky is well respected by a lot of people. He seems like a smart guy, but he blew it on this. And he really blows it in this documentary. Because what he says in the clip I'm about to play for you is just flat out absurd, especially coming from somebody who is perceived as somewhat of a Joe Paterno defender. But here it is Joe Pausnansky describing what it was that Mike McQueary actually saw and what he told Joe Paterno, and then some media coverage of that reality.
Joe Paterno, at that point, has a small role in the presentment. He's told by Mike McQueary, graduate assistant, that he saw Jerry Sandusky committing a crime in the shower at Penn State.
The graduate assistant had seen Jerry Sandusky fondling or doing something of a sexual nature to a young boy. Paterno's...
All right, now, let's go in order there. The first thing there is that Pausnansky says something incredibly absurd when he says that McQueary witnessed and told Joe Paterno about a crime. That didn't happen. The word crime was certainly never used by McQueary to Paterno. It certainly was never used by Paterno in his grand jury testimony, which you can tell from that quote from the grand jury presentment that Anderson Cooper read at the end of that clip, which is a very sneaky thing that the grand jury presentment did. That, it's just amazing of all the amazing things about this case. The fact that so much of this damage was done based upon a grand jury presentment is a flat-out joke, because a grand jury presentment is written by the prosecution, and this particular presentment was written in an incredibly biased fashion. And that statement there that Anderson Cooper read is a classic example. Paterno says in his grand jury statement, it was a sexual nature. By the way, I happen to think that it would have been very easy for the transcriptionist to put a question mark at the end of that sentence based upon the rest of the context of Paterno's statement. And then he also uses the word fondling at some point. Well, that gets turned into the grand jury presentment as that Paterno was told of a sexual act, of an act of a sexual nature or fondling. Now that sounds like a very subtle difference, but it's actually pretty significant. It's also, it's not only significant from the standpoint of, boy, that sounds like Paterno is saying that he was told about a crime, although that word was not used. The reality is that that doesn't even fit with Mike McQueary's testimony. Mike McQueary never said anything about fondling, and that's why the charge in the other portions of the presentment was about anal rape. So which was it? So right there's a contradiction. But let me go back to Pausnansky here, because I find this absolutely amazing that Pausnansky would use the word crime, because obviously that's a very, very loaded word here, and one that is just flat wrong. Now, obviously, if in fact there was a sex act of any sort between Sandusky and the boy in the shower, which I'm positive there wasn't for many reasons, that would be a crime. But Pausnansky is saying, in no uncertain terms, that that's what McQueary told Paterno. And that's just flat out wrong. I mean, there is in no evidence whatsoever that McQueary said to Paterno, I saw a crime. And there's no evidence, in my view, that a crime existed or that McQueary acted like he saw a crime. Ask yourself this. If you had seen a crime and you're Mike McQueary, do you ever play in a Jerry Sandusky golf tournament again, which McQueary did twice? And I believe there'll be photographic evidence that will be eventually revealed to indicate that. Would you joke around with him physically at an Easter Seals charity football game, which numerous witnesses say they remember, and Jerry remembers vividly, McQueary and Sandusky joking around with each other physically at that charity football game? Would you ask Jerry Sandusky about a walk-on at Central Mountain High School when you knew he was an assistant high school football coach coaching high school kids? Would you do that? Would you never report it to anybody else other than Joe Paterno and Tim Curley and Gary Schultz. Would you forget the date, the month, and the year in which it happened? These are all facts about Mike McQueary's reaction. And to me, the most important thing Mike McQueary said, and I probably myself don't harp on this enough, is that I believe it was his preliminary hearing testimony in late 2011, he was asked, because he had said that he started telling people around the program that Jerry shouldn't be around. Now, that's a pretty damning statement, because that acts like that's an act that indicates you may have seen a crime, right? That's very damaging. If you're telling people that Jerry Sandusky shouldn't be around the program, and a legend like Jerry Sandusky, that's consistent with having seen a crime. Well, he got asked, McQueary did you say that to other people before or after investigators came to you in late 2010 and asked you about this situation that had occurred 10 years earlier, almost 10 years earlier, and almost assuredly told you about a grand jury investigation where Jerry is being investigated for sexually abusing boys? And McQueary says flat out, almost certainly after. Well, folks, use your brain. That's the whole case right there. McQueary never thought he saw a crime until after investigators came to him 10 years earlier. It's the key to the whole case. It really is. Because McQueary doesn't act like he saw a crime up until that time, and his own words prove it. So this is incredibly important. I mean, basically, this whole case boils down to, did it start with a pebble or an avalanche? You know, whatever metaphor you want to use. Or, you know, did it start with a tiny snowflake, or did it start with a giant snowball that went down the mountain? Another analogy I've used is the fire analogy. Did it start with a smoldering cigarette on the side of the road, or did it start with a 5-alarm fire that, for some reason, Penn State tried to ignore? It's my view, for many reasons, that if anything, it was a pebble, or a tiny snowball, or a smoldering cigarette. Because while it certainly seems strange to be showering naked with a boy at night, on a Friday night, the prosecution, by the way, tried to make it sound like it was the Friday night of spring break, which it wasn't, because McQueary got the wrong year and the wrong month. But I acknowledge it's weird, and it's certainly a red flag, except when you find out that the so-called victim number 2, in this case, Alan Myers, said on the day Joe Paterno was fired that nothing ever happened that night or any night with Jerry. He had an extraordinarily extensive relationship with Jerry. He felt like investigators tried to get him to lie in his police interview. He would never say anything bad about Jerry, and he's never changed that story. He's gotten paid $3 million by Penn State, interestingly, through the same lawyer that Matt Sandusky uses, the same lawyer who is a huge star in this film, but for some reason doesn't produce Alan Myers. Wonder why Alan Myers isn't in this film. Wonder why Alan Myers isn't even mentioned in this film. Victim 2 isn't even mentioned in this film. In fact, after Pausnansky's statement, the McQueary episode is hardly ever even referred to, even though it's the entire case, both against Paterno and even against Sandusky. Because without McQueary, they never even arrest Jerry Sandusky. I guarantee it. People think that's laughable now because it seems like there were all these victims, but at the time they didn't have those victims because they didn't know they were going to get money. On November 7th or 8th of 2011, all of a sudden they knew they were going to get money, and on the 9th it was positive. Shockingly, that's when all these other victims came forward. So even though this seems like a small point, I think it's incredibly important. And one of the things I learned from this movie, very few things I learned since I know pretty much everything about this case, is that clearly Alan Myers is never going to do an interview saying he was abused, because if he was ever going to do an interview saying he was abused, it would have been in this movie. Because after all, his lawyer's a star, his buddy Matt Sandusky's a star. There ain't going to be another movie of this type like this unless the narrative dramatically changes, which I doubt at this point, unfortunately. But that's the reality. That's the number one thing maybe people ought to take from this, but only fans of FramingPaterno.com are going to learn that from this movie. All right, so let's go from Joe Pausnansky to Scott Paterno. And Scott Paterno is an incredibly important figure in this case. And I want to explain some things about Scott Paterno, because I'm sure that there's a lot of misunderstanding with regard to my role and Scott Paterno. It's funny because I get criticized a lot for a lot of things, some justifiably so, most not. And ironically, some of the biggest mistakes I've made in this case are being too nice and too trusting. I know that would probably be shocking to people, but that's the reality. And I was actually too trusting of Scott Paterno in this case. I mean, he and I are mortal enemies now, but at the beginning of all this, when I first got involved, I actually trusted Scott that he had to know something. I mean, he was right there. He was the guy who said, and when you'll see in a second, he was very, very proud of this. He was the guy who said, Joe, you're going to get fired, according to Pausnansky's book. And he seemed to, he was running the Paterno defense that first week. He was Joe's lawyer. Obviously, he's Joe's son. I'm thinking, he's got to know something. Well, he was the only person that I talked to, of dozens and dozens of people close to this case, the only one who didn't fit. What he was telling me just didn't fit. And it held me back in my conclusions dramatically, because I thought, I can't make this work. This doesn't make any sense. Everything is telling me that Mike McQueary could not have seen an assault. Yet Scott Paterno is telling me constantly, lay off Mike. We're not going to do anything to be critical of Mike. Mike saw an assault. These are almost direct quotes. He didn't believe that victim 2 was Alan Myers, and if he was, he said it didn't matter whether there was an assault, which really stunned me. That was extraordinary to me, that Scott Paterno was so desperate in one of our conversations. In fact, our last telephone conversation, which was epic, he actually told me it didn't matter whether or not there was an assault. It only mattered what Mike said he saw. Oh, okay, but that presumes there was no connection between what Mike saw and what Mike said at the time, which I've already stated by his own testimony changed 10 years later. So I could never figure out what the heck is going on with Scott. And one of the most bizarre things was that Scott really ran away as fast as he could, although he can't run very fast for obvious reasons, but okay, I digress. He ran away as fast as he could from this whole theory, which is really the only way Joe gets exonerated here, is if Joe's testimony 10 years later was based upon a misrecollection of what Mike had told him in 2001, which I think makes perfect sense, and so does everybody else close to this case, except Scott Paterno. So it never made any sense to me. Why is Scott running away from this? Well, suddenly, I don't know how long ago it was, but it was a few months ago, and it really got crystallized in my mind when Jay Paterno's book came out and Jay started doing interviews. I became very, very positive of this, that what really happened here is that it wasn't that Scott Paterno had information that I don't have. By the way, I've asked Scott Paterno numerous times. I've offered Scott Paterno. I said, if you have some information I don't have, please tell me, and if you prove to me I'm wrong, I will publicly apologize to you and take down the website. And anyone who knows me knows when I make a promise like that, I'm as serious as a heart attack. I have asked him numerous times. I've never gotten even anything close to a substantive response. So then I started to realize, well, it's not that Scott knows something I don't. It's that Scott has a very unusual self-interest here. And the reality is that his self-interest is very different than people perceive. People would perceive his self-interest to be exonerate Joe Paterno at all costs. This is about Scott Paterno, and about Scott Paterno being the family hero in the one big event he's ever been a part of in his entire life. And if I'm right, he's no longer the hero, the guy who figured this all out before anybody else. He's the GOAT for jumping to conclusions about things that turned out to be false and basing the Paterno defense on a completely false premise, a premise that actually did them great harm. So to back this up, and I felt this way for quite a while, but this movie actually backs up my theory 100%, and I'll show you why here in just a second. Now, I have to find the clip, and that might be a little bit difficult here because of the visuals here I'm having a difficult time with, but let me see if I can find it. All right. Okay. That's Jerry, obviously. That's the riots. All right. And that's Jay Paterno. And here is Scott Paterno. Okay, let's watch some of Scott Paterno. And this is him bragging about being the first one to figure out what was really going on here, when in reality, he's bragging about rushing to judgment about something that wasn't true.
Jerry, and it'll move on, and they'll get off our porch, and that'll be the end of it. My parents were both very worldly in the sense that they were very well read, but they were unbelievably naive. I read the presentment, and I made the conclusion almost immediately that Dad had probably coached his last game. I called him Sunday morning and said, you need to get your head around the possibility. You know, you give me sort of the one of that, you know, and I said, Dad, you really need to think about it. He said, I appreciate you telling me that. I appreciate where you're coming from. He said, you know, I got to get ready for the Nebraska game. He had not read the presentment when we said that. I said, you have to read what they're reading. They're reading that Mike saw you being anally raped, told you about it, and you didn't do anything more than tell these guys up the chain. I said, the way that reads, it's going to be a problem.
All right, now, how that helps Joe Paterno, I have no idea. Now, I'm going to be exceedingly fair to Scott, which I actually have been throughout, sometimes too fair, and presume that what he's saying there is somewhat out of context, because it sounds in the movie like he's saying it's going to be a problem, and it deserves to be a problem because you really screwed up. That's the implication. Now, I don't think that's what Scott means. And interestingly, you know, this is almost a direct quote from Pausnansky's book. Pausnansky writes about Scott in almost that exact same way, which is, I've always believed that's why Scott is way too supportive of Joe Pausnansky, because Pausnansky makes Scott Paterno look good for having figured this all out sooner than everybody else, that Joe was going to get fired. Well, I asked Scott about that. I said, Scott, you know, the way Joe writes it, it almost makes it sound like you're saying that this was justified. And Scott blew me off and said, no, it doesn't. I don't mind it at all, because I thought Pausnansky was unfair in the way that he wrote it, because he left that implication that Scott was saying you deserved to be fired and that this was a big problem. You screwed up here. Well, frankly, I now believe that Scott doesn't care because it makes Scott look good. It doesn't matter that it makes Joe look good or bad, and it doesn't matter that it makes Penn State look bad, because it's all about Scott. And most people are all about themselves, but it just never occurred to me that under these circumstances, Scott could be more concerned about himself than about his dad and his dad's legacy and his family and all that. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that that's his only motivation. I don't believe that Scott is evil. I think Scott had probably good intentions throughout all this. I'm not alleging a conspiracy at all, at all. I'm alleging that Mike McQueary and Scott Paterno both had a huge self-interest in making sure that Joe Paterno backed up the main witness in this case and didn't impede the prosecution or this investigation. So in Scott's mind, and you got to remember, Scott is a Republican lobbyist at this point. This is a Republican investigation, Republican Attorney General, Republican governor. He believes these people. He believes in the establishment. Scott does. I know this from our conversations. They have him by the balls. He's not going to cross this investigation. These are his people. So he buys in totally. He buys in that this is all real. And I think that was a tragic mistake. A tragic mistake. And I think that buying in that it was all real was partially why he and Mike, or some combination thereof, misrefreshed Joe's recollection of what Mike had told him 10 years earlier. And there's no question Mike has a huge incentive for Joe to back him up. And Scott has a huge incentive, because Scott is Joe's lawyer on this. He just wants to make damn right well sure Joe doesn't get charged with anything. He's his lawyer. That's his role. That's his job at this point. Make sure his client, as he refers to his dad, doesn't get charged. Well, he accomplished that, but it didn't work out very well. Partially because of what Scott does next in this clip in the movie Happy Valley, which this to me is just amazing on so many levels and deserves to be watched carefully.
true.
Gentlemen, thank you very much, guys. First off, we really appreciate it. We really appreciate the show of support. And before you guys continue cheering, can we just take a minute and say a prayer for guys? Look, no matter how this works out, there's a horrible story that involved a lot of kids getting hurt. And as a father of 3 kids, you guys take a moment, say a prayer, and then please feel free to cheer, feel free to show your support. But let's remember that we want to show the support for the victims first. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I have nothing more to say. This was for them. Thank you very much, guys. Scott Paterno! Scott Paterno! Scott Paterno!
Wednesday.
Now that is incredibly ironic, because it's probably almost for sure the first and last time that Scott Paterno has ever had his name chanted at a rally like that. And it was for doing something that might have been the dumbest thing he's ever done. I'm sure at the time, because I know Scott pretty well, when you do battle with someone, you learn a lot about them quickly. I know exactly what Scott was thinking there. You know, Scott was thinking we need to embrace the politically correct nature of what the media is doing here, embrace the victims, we need to show remorse, we need to show that we get it. And you know what? Being fair to Scott, in a rational world, that might have worked. But they weren't in a rational world anymore. They were in the twilight zone. And it clearly didn't work. And in fact, in retrospect, and at the time, this was the dumbest thing Scott could have done. First of all, he destroys Jerry's chance of a fair trial right there. Because on the Paterno lawn, essentially, Joe Paterno is declaring Jerry Sandusky guilty. That's devastating. And it's not just devastating to Jerry Sandusky and his due process rights. It's devastating to the Paterno family. Because once Jerry has no chance at a fair trial, then the Jerry as monster narrative has no restrictions. And Jerry gets turned into the most horrific figure in the history of man, which now means that, one, Joe Paterno didn't do enough to stop a monster, and two, Joe Paterno had to know. Because how could you not know that this monster was living, you know, right there with you and working with you and all that? It's all a myth, but that's what the media wanted. So Scott, in giving the media what they wanted, actually inadvertently, I believe, set the tone for everything that happened after this. And Scott was wrong. Scott was wrong that there was an assault that Mike McQueary saw. I'm almost positive he was wrong that Joe Paterno was told about any sort of assault. And I'm as positive of that Scott was wrong in presuming that Jerry Sandusky was guilty, and that 2 days after a grand jury presentment, which as a lawyer he should have known was bullcrap and not worth the paper it was written on, he's already saying prayers for the victims and saying that lots of boys were damaged here. I mean, that's just an extraordinarily stupid thing to do, and wrong, flat out wrong for Scott Paterno to do it. And it has had devastating consequences on this entire case, and it has absolutely turned around and had massive negative impact on Joe Paterno and the Paterno family and the Penn State and the Penn State administrators and all of them. And it's all because of Scott Paterno. And so if I'm right, Scott Paterno turns from being the family hero of this week, which he's very proud of, as you can see in that clip, to the biggest goat in the history of the world, and it's all his fault, and he can't have that, which is why he hates me, why he has done everything he possibly can to destroy me, and why, by the way, all those things are perfectly consistent with the fact that I'm right. And my goal here has been to give Joe Paterno what he wanted on his deathbed, the truth of this matter, no matter where that goes. And even if it means condemning a member of the Paterno family, Scott Paterno, again, not because of ill intent, but because of incompetence and a misperception of what occurred here, is the real key to understanding the great injustice of this case. I want you to continue to tune into www.framingpaterno.com. Check out our second video on this documentary, Happy Valley, and my name is John Ziegler.